Well, good evening, everyone, on this beautiful Wannsee evening. Thanks for coming out. My name's RJ McGill. I'm the manager of communications here at the American Academy and the editor of our Berlin Journal. And on behalf of the Academy, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's Axel Springer lecture by Cymene Howe. The Axel Springer Fellowship was initiated in 2003 with the express aim of promoting German-American dialogue in the fields of media, public policy, and other pressing contemporary concerns. We're deeply grateful to the Axel Springer Foundation and Axel Springer Company, and to the CEO, Matthias Dopfner, who is a longtime trustee, for their support over all these years. Joining us tonight to introduce Cymene and to moderate is Professor Dr. Ignacio Farias, a professor of urban anthropology at the Institute of European Ethnology at Humboldt University. There, he also co-directs the Stadtlabor for Multimodal Anthropology, as well as the Georg Simmel Center for Metropolitan Studies. I'm going to give a brief intro of Professor Farias and then hand the floor to him. Professor Farias' research focuses on current ecological and infrastructural transformations of cities and the resulting political and epistemological challenges to what he calls the democratization of city-making. To this end, Professor Farias leads a European Research Council grant team that explores how sun radiation, environmental noise, and wireless signals are sensed, conceptualized, and problematized by affected communities and by scientific experts. The team also looks at how cities are adapting infrastructures to meet these kinds of atmospheric challenges. In the Collaborative Research Center group, The Refiguration of Spaces, Professor Farias adopts a more historical perspective to explore the formation of urban climatology and when and how, if at all, it became relevant to urban planning. Finally, in a series of ongoing projects, Professor Farias is collaborating with citizen associations and architectural collectives involved in Haus der Statistik and the Floating University, two model projects of commons-oriented urbanism in Berlin. He's also writing a book with the visual artist Mirja Busch, who's also here tonight. I'm not sure what it's about, but maybe you can tell us about that. But before I hand the floor over to Professor Farias, let me to introduce Cymene. Here's how these evenings work for those of you who are fellows who have been here many times. After Professor Farias' introduction, Cymene will speak for about 35 minutes. Then they will have a Q&A, a conversation here at the table, and you will have an opportunity to ask questions, whether you're in the audience or over Zoom at that time. If you are on Zoom, this is the cliche we have to repeat every time, do not use the raise your hand function in Zoom. Instead, type your question into the Q&A part of the Zoom platform, and we'll try to get to the questions. We apologize in advance if we're unable to get to all of them, but please do ask them. And then at the end, we'll welcome you all for a reception in the adjoining room. But before that, Professor Farias, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for this kind introduction, and it's really a great pleasure to have the opportunity to introduce Cymene Howe today to you and to kind of review a little bit some of her main accomplishments. So Cymene Howe is a professor of cultural anthropology at Rice University and also a visiting professor in anthropology at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology. Currently, you all know, she's an Axel Springer Fellow at this American Academy. Cymene's research centers around issues of environment and infrastructure, politics and ethics, elements and affect, as well as other than human worlds. Her ethnographic research has ranged from political movements in Central America to energy transition and climate change mitigation in Mexico, and now to climate adaptation in the Arctic region and also in coastal cities around the world. Her anthropological practice emphasizes feminist analytics, collaborative work, and creative approaches to research, thinking, and making. In her work as an editor, Cymene served as part of the three-person editorial collective for the journal Cultural Anthropology, one of the top journals in our discipline. She currently serves as co-editor for the encyclopedic John Hopkins Guide to Critical and Cultural Theory, and she has edited also 3 books focusing on issues related to the Anthropocene, solarities, elemental forms, and human and non-human rights. She is currently working on a trade book entitled The Art of Living at the End of the World, Lessons in Precarity. Cymene has published 2 monographs, both with Duke University Press. Her book, Intimate Activism, from 2013, narrates how sexual rights activists in Nicaragua helped to overturn the most repressive anti-sodomy law in the Americas. Featuring the voices of activists and television producers, non-governmental organizations, and transnational rhetorics of identity and rights, Cymene centers attention on the process of becoming queer subjects as a biopolitical process of assemblage. Based on that experience, she has served and continues to serve as an expert witness on asylum claims brought by Nicaraguan nationals to the US, and actually with each applicant ultimately gaining asylum protection in the US. During the last decade, Cymene has centered her research around questions of climate change, energy transition, and the political figures of the Anthropocene. In her second book, Ecologics, Wind and Power in the Anthropocene, she builds upon her research in Oaxaca, Mexico, or building upon that, she examines the political, social, and ecological dimensions of moving from fossil fuels to wind power. The book tells the story of Mareña Renovables, what would basically have been Latin America's largest wind park, but it didn't come to be. And in the book, she documents like all the different actors, corporate interests, state interventions, as well as indigenous people's resistance to the project. Using both feminist and more than human theories, Cymene shows us in the book how the dynamics of energy projects cannot be captured without understanding how these projects intersect with non-human beings, technomaterial objects, and the geophysical forces that are at the heart of both wind and power. Let me also add that Cymene has been very committed to collaborative, multimodal approaches to research. That is basically forms of inquiry and research dissemination that use more than textual approaches to different social issues. She developed a short graphic novel centered on a proto-apocalyptic feminist Bildungsroman. She also held an artist residency in Djupavik in Iceland, and also working with Icelandic collaborators, she co-created the world's first memorial to a glacier that fell to climate change, and which was also nominated to a bunch of awards, among them the award of the Design Museum of London. And the glacier memorial in Iceland has also generated like a great deal of public media attention. Some of you might have heard of this already, and was on the news globally. With Dominique Boyer, her partner, she produced the documentary film Not Okay or Not Oka, because it's, or Not Ok, I guess. Yeah. Not Ok, right? A little movie about a small glacier at the end of the world that was based on that research in Iceland. They also together created the Wind House, an installation that aimed to bring the wind of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec into the interior of a gallery space so that visitors might feel the powerful near hurricane force of the winds that blow power into being in southern Mexico. And also with Dominic, she has hosted over 200 episodes of the podcast, Cultures of Energy, where they meet and talk to environmental activists, artists, academics, and others. Her current research, which we will hear about today, has been supported by the American Scandinavian Foundation and the U.S. National Science Foundation, and this is a work in progress, and I won't say anything about it because we're about to hear this. And I'm really looking forward to seeing how this work on climate impacts and adaptation has been evolving, and really looking forward to this. So please join me in welcoming Cymene Howe.
So thank you so much, RJ and Ignacio, for the lovely introduction. And also I want to thank the staff here at the American Academy for making this such a warm and welcoming experience always. I'm truly thrilled to be here every day with my fellow fellows and the families here who are truly a joy to be with. And I also want to appreciate the audience here for taking the time to come out this evening. I know there are many fantastic things to do on any given night here in Berlin, and so I really appreciate that you've come out here to be with us. So I wanted to begin with this. A drop of water endlessly erupting from the edge of Solheimajökull glacier in southern Iceland. Now, this is admittedly a tiny bit of water in one small country, but it is also, of course, indicative of a much larger process of transformation that is unfolding all around us. Now, while most people on Earth will never touch or smell or stand upon a glacier, changes to the cryosphere, that is the ice of the world, is and will continue to affect water and weather around the world. Our planetary hydrosphere is being transformed in multiple ways, both physically and socially. And in my discussion this evening, I'd like to focus on how the water of the world is changing. I approach this topic as a cultural anthropologist, and I'm interested in how we, as human beings, collectively interact with and encounter our environments. That means thinking through impacts and adaptations to both social and physical phenomenon, as well as the conceptual, creative, and political possibilities that might afford us. Essentially, what I'd like to do this evening is tell a story of water set in motion by the warming world. And for something more to think about, I've actually brought an artifact that RJ will be circulating. So make sure you get your hands on that. I wouldn't be an anthropologist without an artifact of some kind. So my talk this evening is called The Future of Water. But of course, we are already experiencing the present and the presence of water. Many of you will remember the catastrophic flooding across Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany, as well as other countries in the summer of 2021 that killed 243 people. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, heavy precipitation events will intensify and become more frequent in most regions with additional global warming. They go on to say that human-induced climate change is likely the main driver of an increase in the frequency and intensity of torrential rainfall since the 1950s. They also go on to say that this storm was likely impacted by climate change and, in fact, made the flooding much worse. Sorry. So here you see some of the damage to Erfstadt, just south of Köln, after the torrential rains of July 2021. And I want to point out that you actually see water pouring from the streets here. If you look at the concrete there, you can see this kind of waterfall of water coming off the street. So of the 243 people killed in the summer floods, 200 of those deaths happened in Germany. And commentators have pointed out that the scale of death and destruction in Germany, the world's fourth largest economy and a nation with a formidable reputation for technical innovation and engineering prowess, has raised real concerns about the readiness of even the richest countries to deal with climate disruptions going forward. This past summer, Germany lost one of its 5 glaciers due to extremely hot weather in the Bavarian Alps. The remaining 4 glaciers in the country shrunk to a fraction of their original size. Glaciers, especially mountain glaciers, are an important freshwater reservoir as well, with about 2 billion people depending on glaciers for drinking water and crop irrigation. In the Himalayan basins, one of which you see in the picture here, 129 million farmers have already been affected by melting glaciers and the resulting loss of available water. So we know that melting glaciers add to rising sea levels, which in turn increases coastal erosion and elevates storm surge as warmer air and ocean temperatures create more frequent and intense coastal storms like hurricanes and typhoons. The combination of oceanic thermal expansion, that is warmer water, and the addition of meltwater create bloated oceans. But of the two, it is meltwater, specifically from the Arctic region, that is contributing the most by far to sea level rise globally. When we look at sea level rise in Germany, and this is from a study in 2020, we see that an area up to 9,000 square kilometers could be inundated by the year 2100. This would affect a population of almost 630,000 people, depending on how much and how rapidly we are able to bring down emissions. Here we see Hamburg in 2100. In light blue, you see the impact of 2 meters of sea level rise. That is in a 2 degrees Celsius scenario laid out by the IPCC. And in dark blue, you see 3 meters. That's the 4 degrees Celsius scenario. This would displace over 20% of the 400,000 people in the region. A 2021 study showed that by 2100, with 1 meter of sea level rise and 0 population growth, the number of people affected by rising seas could increase to 410 million people globally. In the United States, sea levels along the coast will rise by about 1 foot or more on average by the year 2050, and at least 2 feet of sea level rise by 2100 will be seen in the United States. So in addition to these kinds of projections, many of you will also be familiar with this relatively new diagnostic, a concept called the Anthropocene. This is a proposed geological epoch where human activity is the primary force of geological change, deeply influencing both the planetary climate as well as the larger environment. So it's important to point out here that not all human activity is equal here, either in the past or in the present. Those of us who live in the industrialized North have contributed far more to the problem of the Anthropocene than other populations have. And the Anthropocene as a concept has generated quite a bit of discussion and some controversy. I'd be happy to talk more about some of those controversies in the question and answer period. But what is not in question is that one of the fundamental conditions of climate disruption and its effects is that it has increased an attunement to precarity. So this is what the anthropologist Anna Singh defines as life without the promise of stability. Now, this sense of instability, of course, is something facing many people the world over. As Judith Butler has described, precarity is a universal condition of human life. And yet, Butler goes on to say, we experience it in highly singular ways. While there is nothing new about precarity per se, what may feel different these days is a sense of precarities multiplied. Not only the violence and inequalities that people have often exercised against one another, but the magnification of those ills through the disintegration of ecosystems and climatological upheaval. So the vulnerabilities of precarity and their uneven distribution is also the reason why a commitment to climate justice must always be at the forefront of everything that we do in this space. As a social scientist, my big questions all pivot around the fundamental question of how we adapt to the climate crisis in its very many and multiple forms. So in a practical sense, I'm curious about how we navigate the catastrophic impact of climate disruption to ensure that climate justice is central. And in an analytic sense, I'm interested in how we conceptualize and think through these shared conditions that have very different effects. And in a broader epistemic and narrative sense, how do we recognize and how do we portray these phenomena that are both natural and social in form? Because as the botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is also an enrolled member of the Potawatomi Nation, has very beautifully put it, a wider ecological consciousness requires the acknowledgement and celebration of our reciprocal relationship with the rest of the living world. And what I would add to Kimmerer's brilliant words is that in these times, it means reciprocities with the non-living world as well, and how those two things fit together. So let me now rewind back to that image of the drop of water slowly falling from the edge of Solheimajökull. Because this project really began over 2,000 kilometers to the northwest of where we now sit in the country of Iceland. I called that research Melt, the Social Life of Ice at the Top of the World. And with it, I was trying to understand how Icelanders were contending with the loss of ice all around them, in a country where about 10% of the land is covered in ice, but which is also losing about 10 billion tons of ice every single year. In that research, I spoke with glaciologists like Guðfinna Magnúsdóttir, who you see here in the foreground with the pencil in her hand. She's with a group of students on top of Solheimajökull where they're measuring the retreat of the glacier. And in those conversations, Guðfinna said this to me, that with climate change, what we are doing is undertaking the largest uncontrolled experiment in the history of the world. And she said, with more than a little irony in her voice, we will see where that leads us. I also spoke to people like Guðni Gunnarsson, who is here pointing to the glacier that lives in the valley behind his farm. Guðni has no love for glaciers, he explained to me, because he remembers stories of people and houses and animals being washed out to sea by glacial outburst floods, lost to the cold waters of the North Atlantic. And while Guðni has always been ambivalent about the glacier in his backyard, he wanted me to take this picture, he said, for posterity, for that day when the glacier would be gone. And when I spoke with Hulda Jónsdóttir, who grew up in the Westfjord region of Iceland, she recalled the sound of sea ice in the harbor when she was a little girl growing up. These icebergs would crash in and out of the harbor, making this frictional chorus of high-pitched whines that early Arctic explorers often called the Devil's Symphony. She doesn't hear those any longer. The author, filmmaker, and environmental activist André Snær Magnusson put it this way: glaciers were forever. When my grandmother traveled across the glaciers, it was in the context of eternity. It was like the waves, the rocks, the sand, things that would change only over thousands of years. But now, many of these same glaciers will vanish in the time between someone is born today and when they become my grandmother's age. Here is there's a certain kind of iconicity to glaciers in Iceland. It'll come as no surprise. And this is a beautiful series of glacier photographs over time by the artist Ólafur Eliasson. In the midst of these reckonings with glaciers and with ice and the people who live near them, my research partner Dominic Boyer and I stumbled across this. It was a very short story in an English language magazine. And we came to see this as a kind of obituary of a kind. It was only 76 words in total, and it was announcing that one of Iceland's smallest yet most famous glaciers, Ok, is about to forever disappear because, as it says, Ok no longer qualifies as a glacier. The glacier called Ok, or Okjökull, since Jökull means glacier in Icelandic, now ceased to exist as a glacier, and it was the first of Iceland's named glaciers to be destroyed by climate change. As the Icelandic glaciologist Oddur Sigurdsson put it, Ok had been killed by heat, and it had been killed by humans. Ok, in other words, was not okay. Okjökull had been on maps for centuries, and Icelandic school children learned their named glaciers much like children in the United States learn the names of states. Here is an aerial image from the 1970s, the mid-1970s, and here you can see the glacier itself at the top. It kind of looks like it has tree rings, these fern lines that cover the surface. And just beneath the glacier is a crater of Auk Mountain, the caldera of an extinct volcano. And I think that crater, the top of Auk Mountain, is making this really strange, smiling face at us. It's kind of winking, or it's got this sort of contorted grimace that it's offering us in some kind of response. Here you see another image of Okyokot in 1986 on the left, taken by a NASA satellite, and again in 2019 when it had diminished to only this, what glaciologists call remnant ice. Here is a more recent image from the top of Auk Mountain, the crater of the mountain covered by a field of snow and ice. When we asked Oldur Sigurdsson, the glaciologist who had declared that Okyokot had passed, how he felt about the loss of this glacier that he had been watching for so long, for much of his career, he put it this way: it is a loss. It is like losing an old friend. So in many of our conversations about the loss of ice, there was this sense of the elegiac. It was both sorrowful and also poetic in both senses of that word. And yet very little had been said or written or done to acknowledge the passing of Okyokot. It was as if the world had shrugged about the loss of this first glacier killed by climate change in Iceland. So we felt that Auk deserved more, that its death was worth recognizing, and so we soon found ourselves organizing a funeral for this little glacier that was. Working with friends and colleagues in Iceland, we held the world's first memorial for a glacier that had fallen to climate change. Here we are on top of Auk Mountain, huddled together for the funeral, and also huddled together because it was very, very cold up there. On top of Auk Mountain, near to where the glacier once lived, we installed a plaque. And we had a number of youth climate activists with us on that trip, and we also had a bunch of children. So we asked the children to push the plaque into place, kind of sealing the future. And we had asked the poet Andrei Snær Magnusson to write the words for the monument. And it read as a letter to the future. It says, first in Icelandic and then in English, Auk is the first Icelandic glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it. And then below there you see the parts per million of carbon dioxide that was taken at Mauna Loa that month from the station of monitoring climate greenhouse gases. So these photos were taken 2 years after the funeral, and you can see that the plaque now has this really beautiful patina to the metal. It's like the weather has found its way into the metal itself, and the plaque itself is starting to look like it's becoming more like the stone onto which it's placed. And someone, you can see if you look in the corner here at the larger picture, someone had left a bouquet of flowers a couple of days prior. I also want to say that the feeling on top of the mountain for the funeral and the memorial that day was not overall elegiac. It was, in fact, more a feeling of collective purpose and a feeling of collective action that we might undertake. So, as Ignacio said, that funeral ended up generating a lot of media attention globally, including on television here in Germany and in the United States, as well as in print and other media around the world. One of our big takeaways from that experience was that the story of climate change cannot be just a story of catastrophe. The story of catastrophe is simply no longer enough to explain or act upon the conditions that we face. There need to be other stories, and there need to be stories of both sentiment and of action. So some of the most gratifying moments coming out of the memorial were small ones like this tweet that someone sent to us, where the author says, As a longtime reader of The Economist, I have often been moved by the obituary column, but I was astonished to find myself weeping over the death of the Ökjökull glacier in Iceland, a response triggered as much by the beauty of the writing as the poignancy of the event. Later that day, I called my broker and divested all of my fossil fuel holdings. So this is one maybe small but nonetheless significant effort in the right direction, moving toward what Andre described as what needs to be done. So here's another picture from the top of Oak Mountain that I took in 2018. I love how the ice is collecting on one side of the rocks of the cairn, you can see. This is where the wind blows the ice and the water into place. So learning about the dramatic life of melt in Iceland, one can't help but also think about the impact of that melted water elsewhere, namely upon the world's oceans and seas. So one question I began to ask early on in this project was, what if we could follow the water? That is, to go from melt to rise. So with the Melt Rise project, I'm interested in trying to understand how water that has been set in motion by anthropogenic climate disruption may be creating new interrelationships between and among people that are otherwise distant and disconnected. Now, to be able to follow the water from sites of melt to sites of rise is in fact not easy. I spoke with many scientists to see if it was possible, but it was only recently that a group of NASA physicists developed a tool that allows us to do just that. With this online device, which you can find on the internet, you can locate any one of 293 coastal cities around the world. And this, the gradient fingerprint map, will indicate exactly which glacial regions or ice sheets are generating sea level rise for that particular city. So for New York, which we have up here, for example, you can see that much of the sea level impact from melting ice is coming from Antarctica as well as from Greenland. And you can see that in those blue bars. I had a chance to sit down with the lead physicist who developed the model, the GFM model, and he explained it this way. Melt ice anywhere in the world, and we can show you the shape that the ocean will adopt. So when we look to glacial regions in places like Iceland and Greenland, for example, we find something rather surprising to that reshaping of the ocean. And that is that melt manifests as sea level rise in very surprising and I think often very counterintuitive places. So for example, when Iceland melts, no city in the world is more affected by that process than the city of Cape Town, South Africa. And when Greenland melts, no city in the United States is more affected than that of Honolulu, Hawaii. So here's a little graphic that I developed for my research proposal to the National Science Foundation. This is the kind of thing that NSF reviewers really like to see, these very tidy little graphs and picturesque ways of manifesting some kind of research methodology. And it shows us how we might compare adaptation practices in each of these sites of both melt and rise, as well as between these places and across these different communities. So basically, this is to evaluate how social responses are unfolding, whether these are related to policy mandates or financial investments, infrastructure, or cultural preservation initiatives, among and between people and places who are directly experiencing either cryospheric loss or hydrological gain. So this research is still in process. We're only about halfway through the ethnographic work. But we already see infrastructural changes. So in Iceland, for example, the loss of ice has reduced the weight on the island nation, and it is thus rebounding more dramatically than it was in the past. So essentially, the island of Iceland is rising up out of the sea, meaning that ports and harbors have to be retrofitted. So this trawler, this fishing boat in the little town of Höp, can now only go in and out at high tide because the land around Höp has been rising up out of the water at about 2 centimeters per year. And actually near to Höp, a couple miles further and closer to the glacier Vatnajökull, the ground is actually rebounding even more, closer to 4 centimeters per year. So we haven't yet done our field research in Cape Town, but we know that they are also bracing for the effects of that Icelandic meltwater. Sandbags, or what is often called shoreline hardening, are becoming more common. And research from 2021 showed that 80% of the beaches in Cape Town are now under threat from rising sea level and coastal erosion. So here you see the edge of Jakobshavn Glacier. Jakobshavn is the fastest glacier in the world, and it empties into the ice fjord of Ilulissat. It was an iceberg from Jakobshavn, they believe, that actually sunk the Titanic. So we are going to be making a trip to that very ice fjord, hopefully not sinking like the Titanic, when we go to Greenland this April, leaving from the American Academy to do some field research in Greenland. In August of last year, a study showed that at least 8 inches of sea level rise is already locked in for the Greenlandic ice sheet. So that is, even if we stop emitting greenhouse gases today, about 20 centimeters of oceanic rise is coming from Greenland, no matter what, in what scientists call committed warming. So the melting of the Greenland ice sheet is having and will have dramatic effects worldwide. And we know from the gradient fingerprint map that melt is especially impactful for the city of Honolulu. So this is from our field research this last summer. This is an image I took. This is essentially the only road in and out of the community of Hauula, just north of the city of Honolulu. And to me, this image is really the definition of infrastructural precarity and what it means for that community in the future. Just before we arrived to do our field research, this home fell onto the beach on the North Shore, collapsed, not unexpectedly, but maybe surprisingly onto the beach last summer. So outcomes like these show us, as Hi'ile Julia Hobart says it so eloquently, that water's nature is diasporic. It misbehaves in such a way that reminds humans of the limits of their own power and control. So bodies of water have long held a unique place in our collective human imaginary everywhere in the world. Because water is at once a life force that sustains all living beings on Earth, just as it is a life space creating environments and ecosystems where organisms can thrive. And in many cosmological systems, bodies of water are also life forms, that is, sentient beings with powers uniquely their own, interacting with other beings around them. In our times of environmental precarity, I believe that bodies of water are becoming filled with new meaning and with new possibilities, as they are transformed by human-created heat, now channeled into the world's waters through rising temperatures and a warming Earth. So this is a quote from one of our interviews in Honolulu, which I found really resonant and important, I think, because it indicates the qualities of care and emotional attention that are also a part of adaptation. They're also a part of how we adapt. So it is not just about infrastructure or economic investments or policy changes. It is about connections to place and to people and to others, including the non-human others with which we share our biosphere. This is what the feminist philosopher Donna Haraway calls responsibility, cultivating collective knowing and doing across human and non-human spaces of encounter. So in learning the ice and following the water, I've become interested in 2 heuristics that have begun to reveal themselves through this research process. The first is this: the world ocean. For ocean scientists, water encircles the Earth in a relatively uninhibited transit of fluid across the hydrosphere. The seas of the planet are, in this configuration, one body of water, the world ocean, never quite captured in a name like Atlantic or Pacific or Indian or Arctic. And these waters are in constant motion through currents and conveyors and tides. The world ocean also moves skyward, rising into the atmosphere as clouds and reverting earthward as rain and snow, sleet and storm. So this is a hydrological spiral of watery interplay. So this is a picture of the world ocean in a part of the world ocean that we call the Pacific, and that is off the coast of Honolulu. And this is also a picture of the world ocean in a part of that ocean that we would call the Pacific, just a few miles away from that last picture, also in the city of Honolulu, in what is called sunny day flooding. And someone here is also holding in their hand the world ocean, flowing through the crowd somewhere. Yes. Has everyone gotten to hold the world ocean? Just send it flowing. It's in constant motion. Don't drink the world ocean. Because it was actually harvested. It was harvested from that prettier picture from the beach in Honolulu, not from the sunny day flooding streets. So the second heuristic I've been developing in this concept is is this concept that I'm calling hydrological globalization. And hydrological globalization is really, it's meant to call attention to how we were all intimately and sometimes strangely connected through water by the planetary hydrosphere. So while we may have always been linked to and through water in one way or another, my proposition is that climate change is both accelerating and extending that relationship. It's attuning us to that watery connectivity in the form of meltwater and rising seas, extreme rain and floods, overflowing rivers, desertification, and drought. So with hydrological globalization, I am essentially moving from this idea of neoliberal globalization. This is a form of globalization that overtook the world at the end of the Cold War, and toward what we can think of as a kind of Anthropocenic globalization, or the physical, social, and political ties and connections that are created by an Earth system that is being transformed. Essentially, we're moving here from the scapes and flows of conventional forms of globalization that we see in things like human movement and migration, and the exchange of media, the exchange of goods, ideologies, finance, all of these characters and qualities of globalization, toward looking to the physical outcomes of the transformation of the Earth system and how that impacts all of our socio-environmental futures. So, where does that take us? Where does the world ocean and where does hydrological globalization take us? For one, it shows us the importance of bringing the social sciences together with the natural sciences. But even more than that, I think it leads us towards cultural forms that can help us to collectively tell a more profound and also potentially more politically efficacious story. So once we have completed this research, one of our hopes is to create a new program that we might call Sister Cities of the Anthropocene. This is in order to signal how distant places are connected not necessarily by trade or political affinities, but by their climatological relationship across continents and across time and space. So we imagine this as a series of art installations potentially, or maybe geographical markers, perhaps a walkable informational set of sites along a coast or a cryosphere that can better show us how we are intertwined with one another, as well as responsible to and responsible for one another. So in thinking through what to create out of this project, the arts have really been a guiding principle here. So these images are from the photographer Tina Freeman. She's an American photographer who juxtaposes the decomposition of Arctic ice with ruined ecosystems in the Gulf of Mexico. This is what Freeman calls rotten marshes. Here you see an image of Svalbard sea ice right up near the North Pole, and then she has it juxtaposed with this image near New Orleans, Louisiana. Here's an image of the glacial lagoon in Iceland, and then again the Louisiana coast. And so she makes these really beautiful juxtapositions between these interrelationships. I've also found inspiration in poets like Kathy Jetnio-Kijiner, who's on the left here, who's from the Marshall Islands, that part of the world ocean that we know as the Pacific, as well as Aka Niviana on the right, who is also a poet. She's an Inuit woman from Greenland in that part of the world ocean that we call the Atlantic. In late 2018, Jetnio-Kijiner went from her little island where the water continues to encroach, and she traveled to the world's largest island, Greenland, where she met Niviana atop a glacier. There they exchanged shells and stones and recited a poem that they had written together. So here's part of their poem called Rise. Sister of ocean and sand, can you see our glaciers groaning with the weight of the world's heat? I wait for you here on the land of my ancestors, heart heavy with a thirst for solutions, as I watch this land change while the world remains silent. From one island to another, I ask for solutions, and from one island to another, I ask for your problems. Let me show you the tide that comes for us faster than we'd like to admit. So the tide is indeed coming fast, but also the story of catastrophe cannot be the only one that we tell. In this, I really appreciate the words of the writer Zadie Smith when she asks, how do we collectively move from one mode of experiencing climate, the elegiac, what have we done, to the practical question of what can we do? So let me conclude with 3 takeaway thoughts here. First, science has given us the evidence that we need to know, but it has not told us the stories that we need to feel and the stories that compel us to act. That is one of the great tasks that we now face, and also one of the great opportunities that we have and that we get to embark upon. Second, the water of the world, transformed by a changing climate, interconnects us in new ways. How we interpret, sense, and understand that relationship will also tell us something more about our collective responses to climatological instabilities. And finally, the future of water is ours. This water is our future as well. How we shape its course and how it shapes us is a story that is in the making. Thank you.
What I was really kind of trying to get my head around is the question of how do we define when these processes of extinction or death begin? How do we mark that kind of process? And on the one hand, science is there to tell us that Oak does not qualify anymore as a glacier, but somehow this needs to be translated into an experience, as you were just pointing at the very end. But the question is also, extinction is not the processes of extinction that we're witnessing and going through is not just about the disappearance of specific individuals, but it's also about a change, a transformation of the environmental conditions that sustain or not the specific types of life, right? So there is like a trade-off going on there, I guess, between marking the passing of one glacier and making that into an experience that we can really relate to and mourn. And on the other hand, like paying attention to these transformations and processes of extinction that are not just about one glacier, but are about like a larger transformation of conditions in the earth. So I was wondering like how you see those tensions and how that work relate to those tensions.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and I like that you brought up something sort of ecosystemic, that we're seeing the extinction of certain ecosystems, not just certain species.
Right.
And so the science is showing us that there is this 6th grade extinction occurring, and that we are losing more and more species that we even know about. So that is that there are species of creatures that are going extinct that haven't even been discovered yet by the scientists. And so there's a really remarkable loss occurring around us that we're not necessarily recognizing. And I think one of the things that was really interesting about this case of Okiokot is you had this small glacier that went rather unrecognized in its death. And to be able to recognize that death is to be able to call attention to those other extinctions of living things, albeit a glacier is not a living thing. So one of the things that happened a lot in the conversations around Okiokot was this question about the kind of vitality or the animacy of glaciers. And glaciers have, for the scientists who work with them, the glaciologists, they have very interesting descriptions of what constitutes a glacier. It needs to be able to move in order to be alive. If it doesn't move, then it's dead ice. So there's all these sort of metaphors and rhetorics of death and loss that are involved in the kind of qualities that scientists use. Glaciers also have toes and snouts and milk and all these sort of creaturely, organic, animal-like qualities, almost mammalian. And so there's a kind of fascinating, I think, move between scientific categories and the sort of the harsh diagnostics of science that in the way we often think of it, and the kind of humanistic acts of mourning a glacier, or mourning something that was never actually alive. And one of our principles in this was really a death that goes unmourned is an extinction, and a death that is recognized, even in this very human form of a funeral, which is familiar to all cultures everywhere on Earth, that you have a moment to respond and to recognize in this very familiar ritual form. And of course, anthropologists love ritual. This is one of the things that we do. And so in some ways it was very organic or natural or predictable that two anthropologists would come up with the idea of a ritual, I think. And it's it's an important one.
Yeah, thanks. No, that's really great. So I was thinking, moving on to these brilliant cases about what you were showing, like the kind of empirical evidence about what is happening in these places, in Ireland and Cape Town and Honolulu, and how the coastline is also moving, rising, or the sea level rising, or even going down. I thought that what was really interesting there is that we're quite used to this kind of understanding of the coastline as a sort of a fixed line that we have planned on. We have done all sorts of plans based on ideas of fixity of those lines, separating the land and the sea. And in a way, how these stories, I mean, of course, they are very tragic stories and they're highly problematic and so on. But at the same time, they are not just kind of stories of climate destruction or kind of something like that, but they are also about kind of rethinking radically the way in which we think how the environments and ecologies within which we live are kind of constituted. And I guess the whole modern project has been about tracing lines and separating areas and zoning cities and so on. And somehow this can also be taken as a starting point, I guess, to rethink what a coastline is to begin with, also to imagine more amphibious ways of living, to think about how water and land kind of can be reimagined. I mean, these kind of amphibious modes of life have been often imagined as something of the past, something of exotic places, non-modern areas, and like somewhere in Asia, people living at the coast in those ways that are not modern at all, that need to be overcome. But actually, what this is actually telling us, or inviting us also, is to reimagine those articulations of water and land. So I don't know how you think about it. It's not a question; it's kind of a comment. But maybe you can also think with me about this.
Yeah, and as you know, there's been a lot of really interesting work around amphibiousness and the kind of qualities of that, the material form of water and what constitutes the difference between water and land, and that kind of interstitial space, that muddy in between, that muddy liminal space in between. And so it's a fascinating question. We've been talking about amphibious urbanism in Houston, the city where we live and work, because that has faced so much inundation. We had a huge storm, Hurricane Harvey in 2017, that actually there's so much water fell during Hurricane Harvey, over 50 inches, which is about what the city of Houston would normally receive in a year. It received in 4 days. And the weight of that water, since we're talking about the weight of that water actually pushed down the earth underneath the city of Houston by about 2 centimeters. Like, it actually crushed the earth down. So that's the weight of water. And I think it's interesting to juxtapose it too with this question of Iceland, where the weight of the ice is in fact causing more isostatic rebounding, so that you have this rising up out of the ocean. The amphibious is also interesting too when we think about extinctions, because it's amphibians that are really suffering the most from many of these extinction events, because it's their ecosystems that are being highly impacted in the tropics and elsewhere. So I think the amphibious is a really good question. And we were talking earlier about Dilip Dakuna's work about rivers and how we sort of cartographically imagine rivers, the shape of rivers, how they naturally want to move and bend and become differently. But we have very strong modernist restrictions on how those rivers are meant to behave. And so many of us moderns, as Bruno Latour would put it, we want to channelize, we want to control, we want to put concrete into place in order to make sure that those boundaries are securely fastened into place in the ways that we imagine. And, I think that's why some of the quotes that I shared with you, like the one from Hi'ile, Hobart, about the water being diasporic, is really, really on target in that sense, because it wants to move and change and be transformed. So it does not behave in the way we necessarily want it to. But I think it's also a really interesting material form or elemental condition that we can kind of imagine different kind of poetic interventions and artistic interventions and ways of connecting to each other. So that's kind of at the heart of the project.
Let me ask you a bit more about this kind of key term that you proposed at the end of the talk, the idea of hydrological globalization. And I was kind of thinking about the hydrological a little bit, because hydrology is not just water, right? Hydrology is a scientific discipline. And at the end of the talk, you were saying, well, science had given us already the facts. Now it's time for us to transform that into experience, to act upon those facts, and to move on. But, I mean, we are also living in times where science are highly contested. And a lot of things that we take for granted as, well, this is a scientific fact, is contested in many ways. Just a little story about this. And this is from the highlands, the Andean highlands in Peru, where some monitoring systems that have been put in place on the top of mountains to kind of look for how glaciers are melting or not and how fast and so on, have been, for example, attacked by farmers, but also by indigenous communities for many reasons. Some think that kind of distrust the scientists from Europe coming to Peru, and they think these people might say they're doing this, but they might be doing explorations for mining projects. Or some others would say these kind of interventions into the mountains are actually enlivening the spirit of that mountain, and it's actually, instead of controlling and monitoring how this is happening, this is producing actually raising the likelihood of a problem. So, I mean, that's just one example of how science gets contested when it gets localized. So I wonder, this, because this is modeled, right, from NASA about how things are connected, and we can take that somehow at face value. But I guess that those sort of scientific models about interconnections between things and facts might be contested in many ways. So how to think that problem, in a way, into this question of the hydrological globalization. So when these models start to move globally, they might get contested in different ways.
Right, and depending on how they're applied. And this
True.
case you're talking about in Peru, right, the kind of suspicions around the machinations of science and how it has devastated certain communities. And I imagine that I would also attach to that a mistrust of the state and the state actors who are involved in helping these scientists to put these monitors into place. So I think it always has to be context specific and context dependent. And living in the United States and living in the state of Texas in particular, I'm very careful about how I want to frame this question about science. And so that's why I try and be really explicit about the fact that science has given us the evidence and the facts that we need to know, that we need to understand. All of that is available for us. It's like the eco-philosopher Timothy Morton says, we don't need more facts. What we need is more response. But the truth of the matter is that there are still people who doubt the science and who refuse the science. And there is a real act of refusal that we see not just in the United States, but elsewhere around conspiracy theories and how climate change is a hoax, etc. I mean, we saw it from the last president of the United States. Yeah. So I think that those of us who understand that climate transformation, that climate impacts are occurring and that they're human generated, we need to hold ground. We need to hold our ground in that and stand on solid ground, if you will, around the science. But also recognize that we've been talking about the science for many, many decades now. And we've been talking about the politics and having these meetings of the COP and the IPCC, the sets of scientists, for a very long time. And we have yet to fully come to terms with what we need to do in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And we have yet to come to terms with what we need to do in order to respond to the climate crisis in a more fulsome and robust way. So I think it needs to be both. We don't want to ignore the science. We want to recognize it. And in fact, I don't talk about believing in climate change anymore because I think the verb to believe is the wrong verb to use. Because to believe is a matter of faith, and it's not a matter of faith. It's a matter of fact. And so that understanding, I think, is really, really important, too. Do you recognize the science of climate, or do you not? Do you refuse it, or do you acknowledge its reality? But moving beyond that, I think we do need more tools. We need more humanistic tools. We need more ways of speaking with one another and communicating in different ways through images, through words, through performances, through the arts. And I really do think that that can help us move to a turning point that will make a difference that the science hasn't quite gotten us to. Unfortunately, it's hard for people to understand. I think there's a lot of refusal. So we need to have more tools, different tools.
Yeah.
Great questions. Thank you.
Actually, I'm going to use that segue of talking to other people to suggest perhaps that we take some answers from the audience or from Zoom.
Thanks. Yeah. So the floor is open. I think you're first, and then.
First of all, let me give you back the world ocean. Maybe.
Yes.
I don't want to keep on to it. So, yeah, that's too much responsibility.
It's a lot. It's a lot to hold in one's hands.
Exactly. I'm trying to formulate my question in my head, but I remember reading a while ago a philosopher called Lars Svensson, Philosophy of Fear. And I don't remember the number, but he mentioned that, I don't know, a great number of children couldn't sleep at night because of the thought of climate change, because they were terrified and it was this sort of a constant background noise in their head that didn't let them sleep. They were thinking about it. And I think my question is sort of about this process of thinking about catastrophes, and you personally, and as people, as scientists, as academics. First of all, where are you personally at, and how do you deal with these processes of fear, emotions, and thinking? Because I think a lot of people like myself are trying to silence the panic fear of climate change, and at the same time trying to think about it logically, but it's hard to combine both. So what do you think about it? And thank you for the lecture. It was great.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, there's a whole new kind of psychological diagnostic category now called climate anxiety and climate grief. And people are feeling this, and they're going to therapists and talking about grief and anxiety. And it's happening among children, but it's happening among adults too. I mean, maybe children have more reason to feel that grief and anxiety because they have a longer future to face in these conditions. But to me, it's a very reasonable set of fears and responses and emotions to have. And yet, again, kind of going back to Zadie Smith, who's just been writing some really smart stuff on this. She's like, you can't get out of bed every day just worrying about the apocalypse. Like you have to figure out a way to move through it. And so there's a woman who's on Twitter. She's a journalist named Mary Anais Heglar. She has a really nice series of, they're kind of like exercises and responses to how you can fully acknowledge and live within the context of climate crisis and yet take care of yourself and take care of others and then have a more mediated response so that you're not kind of apoplectic all the time or consumed with grief. And, you know, one of the things that I thought was interesting in this fieldwork in Honolulu is that there's a group of youth who are suing the Department of Transportation for not, in Hawaii, for not reducing greenhouse gas emissions, for failing to reduce those emissions. So this is just one example of what they call intergenerational climate justice. And so that's a case that's unfolding. It's very interesting, but we can find cases like this all over the world now, where youth are bringing the legal apparatus to try and contest these things. As Greta Thunberg showed us so adamantly and eloquently, you know, that the grown-ups, the adults in the room, need to really wake up and be shaken up around the next steps. So yeah, thank you for the question. That's good.
Two questions.
Thank you for your presentation from my end as well. Coming from a policy perspective and economic perspective, probably the mirroring page of neoliberal anthropology, if you, so to speak. A politician would probably ask you in worst case scenarios, what is it that we actually have to be concerned about? Is it really the sea level rise? The richest nations could adapt to it, right? They could afford building dams. In the final status scenario, they could move away from the coastal lines, but the poorer nations wouldn't be capable of doing so. And what would it, especially with a focus on potable water, what is the impact of the melting down of the glaciers and the Arctic and the Antarctic polar caps if eventually all the drinkable potable water is only mixed with salt water? What would the impact be on the agricultural necessities of cultures like India, for instance, overpopulated perhaps, given those assumptions? And how would you say, are we doomed to a certain extent, or do we have a perspective of addressing such a scenario at all? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I hate to occupy the space of doom. Try and maintain some kind of optimism, although it's hard to do. And when you pay attention to the climate news and the science, it's very difficult to maintain that optimism. But this is a really important point. I mean, we had this quick picture of the Himalayan basins and all the farmers that are dependent on that meltwater from glaciers. That's the fresh water that they use not only for drinking, the potable water, but also for agriculture. And when you are not able to produce food for communities and for large populations, you have serious issues and political concerns that are going to come out of that very clearly. And I think that's one of the ways, certainly in the conversation, the political conversation around climate refugees, that's where you see the kind of neoliberal globalization that's been so concerned with human movement and migration and finance and trade between nation states come into contact with and conversation with this Anthropocenic globalization, where you have these physical impacts that are making it so that people go into movement and migration in ways that they wouldn't necessarily otherwise. And of course, we're already seeing climate refugees in many parts of the world. So this is a global issue already, and one that needs to be taken into account from a policy point of view. And the question about fresh water is really, really key. These are real reservoirs of fresh water, especially the mountain glaciers. So that will be a question going forward, how those get utilized or don't get utilized. Yeah, thank you.
It was a great, great talk. So I have two questions. One is about the type of care work that's involved in the sort of ecological and hydraulic dynamic that's occurring. And how that's also a type of, so I'm thinking about Christina Sharp's work in terms of thinking about it as wake work, you know, this mourning, this sort of mourning of oak.
Yeah.
And also communing with a variety of you know, ancestors simultaneously. So how much of that is also playing into this larger project that care work is also wake work? And then the second question is about a comment that you made in terms of like, there are sort of species that we have no idea about because of the sort of, you know, the extinction of many of these ecosystems. So part of it is also an intriguing question about epistemic losses. And how does that factor into some of this work that you're doing too? So on the one hand, there's a care work and wake work, but then also how do we repair? Is it even possible to repair some of those epistemic losses in the process? Hope this makes sense.
Yeah, thank you, Tiffany. That's a great question. And Christina Sharp's work is really important in that space around wake work. There's another feminist STS person who I've gone to quite a bit named Maria Puig de la Bellacasa, who does a lot of work on care also, and kind of the question of cross-species care and caring across, you know, from human to other species. I think another interesting point that's been brought up by a fellow anthropologist named Elizabeth Pavanelli is this idea that she calls geontologies, that is the ontology of geos, since you brought up the question of epistemic spaces. So the quality of geos as a non-living entity, right? So her argument is that throughout sort of Western philosophy, the tradition has been to look at the difference or the distinction between life and death, whether that's human life and death or some other life and death. But what she's pointing to is that we need to consider life and non-life, that which is not living. And one of the things that the Anthropocene condition, by whatever name you want to call it, brings very clearly into view is our relationship and our interdependence and our precarity with the non-living world, right? The ice is not alive. The world ocean is not exactly alive, right? These are non-living things, and yet we're completely dependent upon them. And so it's like the non-living feeds into bios in every way. And so these questions of caring for the non-living world as well as the living and recognizing those losses is, I think, as you're pointing out, really, really critically important. So how do we do that? How do we recognize these passings without becoming stuck in that kind of in too much of an elegiac space of loss, and being able to move out of that too?
Thank you very much for your talk that I thought was really touching and beautiful. Two things stuck out for me. That quote that a friend has passed by that glaciologist. And to me, it raised a question of scale. Like, we compare to ourselves to an individual level when the event of extinction is so much bigger. Was it a friend? He would have had children and life would have gone on. But here, obviously, something much larger is at stake. And so I wonder, because I also reflected in myself how big your topic is and how hard it is to wrap my mind around. Yeah. So how do we form a new generation of men that is capable of widening our horizon to not compare the earth to ourselves, but to kind of, take care of that, or it's a different level of magnitude in a way that we would have to wrap our heads around. So how do you see what's the way forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're pointing to this kind of generalized concern about anthropocentrism in a way. How do we sort of talk through care for the Earth system, or the Earth, if we want to think of it that way, without sort of projecting our own human habits onto it, our own personifications. And, that was one of the things that came up in the Glacier Memorial was that, is this anthropomorphizing this glacier too much? It was never really alive. So there's interesting sorts of debates that came out of that. And, whether it's proper to recognize the death of something that was never alive and whether there was too much anthropomorphic emphasis there. But I think, the other piece is that we are human beings and we do think in human scales. You brought up the question of scale. It's really interesting to me because if you look at the IPCC reporting and a lot of the scientific evidence that's coming from the sciences, they often use this year 2100 as this kind of threshold moment. And the reason they do, I've been studying this and kind of looked into it further, the reason they do that is because that is what we humans can imagine the next generation existing. Anything beyond that is very hard for us as humans to imagine because we can't sort of imagine that many generations into the future. So 2100 is sort of my children, maybe my grandchildren, right? And so, there's the poet André Snær Magnusson has a really interesting exercise that he asked us to do several times where he said, imagine someone who who's alive, someone who you love. When you get to be an elder person and you have grandchildren, how long will they be alive in the history of the world? Like, what is the year in which they're still living? Try and imagine that year, and then you can imagine the impacts and what you want the Earth to be like, or you hope that we will be able to have available to them in that time. So there's still something very humanistic about our comprehension space, right? Our ability to kind of picture the future. I mean, very famously in many North American native systems, there's an invocation to be a better ancestor, right? How can I be a better ancestor? When you think about that, that's a lot of responsibility, being a better ancestor. And then how many generations into the future can you be that better ancestor? And I think the kind of modernist system in which many of us live, not all of us, but in which many of us live, is very difficult to make those giant leaps of imagination and to think in really deep, deep time, either in the geological past or into the kind of unfounded future, right? A very famous anthropologist named Marshall Solins used to say that the future is it's hard to comprehend because it's so empty, like it's this kind of empty space. So how do we populate that with emotions and affect and ideas and propositions?
Hi, Cymene. I just want to say thank you. I don't know if you realized it, but you used one of my pictures in your presentation.
Oh, no, I didn't know. Oh, that's so cool. Sorry, copyright.
This one quickly. But I just wanted to say
that's
an
amazing.
eyewitness.
I love that image. I didn't know it was yours.
As an eyewitness, to give it context from that day, so that was in 2019. And if I recall correctly, Jakobshavn Fjord, it's about 300 kilometers north of the Arctic Circle. And I can tell you that on that day, I was wearing a T-shirt.
Wow.
And I wanted to ask you, in your presentation, you showed the two Pacific Islanders who were in some Arctic place. Mm-hmm. For your project, will you bring maybe someone from Hawaii to Iceland or from Cape Town to Greenland?
Yeah, that'd be cool. Let me ask NSF if they can cover that. That'd be great.
Well, let me know and I'll come take a picture of that.
Oh, that'd be cool. Yes, that'd be totally cool. Yeah, those poets were on the Greenlandic ice sheet. That's where they met. And so they wrote the poem together but remotely, and then they came and recited it together. There's a video out there. You can find it. Yeah, it's a really amazing thing that they did. Super beautiful. Yeah, I think that'd be fantastic to bring people and to really make that connection between these distant places, because there's almost no awareness. Sure. If I talk to people in Iceland and say, where is your melted water going? They don't really know. And when we go to Cape Town, I think the answer will be the same. Where is this coming from? So part of the utility of a thing like this NASA device is that it does give us some instrument to follow the water, to show how it moves across the world. Because otherwise it's impossible to do. I talked to a lot of scientists. I said, can can I put like a little tag on a drop of water in Iceland or in Greenland and sort of literally follow it to wherever it goes? They said you could do that, but it would take 200 or 300 years for it to land, right? For it to kind of end up where it will end up. So that's outside of my human lifetime. So that's why the gradient fingerprint mapping device is an interesting tool. You know, it's and I should say it's a little. I didn't go into too much into the science of the tool, but it's a gravimetric model, and so what it does is it looks at the change of mass. So as you lose mass in the Arctic or anywhere, you lose a gravitational pull. That's also part of the reason why Iceland's coming up out of the ocean, is because there's less mass attraction from the Greenlandic ice sheet. Because as the Greenlandic ice sheet loses mass, it becomes lighter, and therefore it doesn't pull the ocean into it as closely. So there's lots of really interesting kind of geophysical things happening around the rotation of the Earth, around the movement of the Earth's axis, and about the way what scientists call the liquid envelope, the Earth's liquid envelope, the world ocean, how that's operating in terms of these changes in the mass distribution, basically.
So, thank you, Cymene. It's been like really, really fantastic.
Yeah,
and please join me in thanking Cymene for this amazing talk.